The sun was hanging low when I felt the hammer slip from my grasp and hit the hard, packed ground with a dull thud. My arms trembled from the day's work, and the baby inside me pressed against my ribs like it too was pushing for air. I bent to pick up the hammer, but the ache in my back stole my breath. That's when I caught sight of him, a tall man standing just beyond the fence line, his shadow long in the orange light. His hat brim shaded his face, but I could tell he'd been there a while, watching without a word. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to choose between your pride and your survival. I'm Sarah Calloway, and I was born on the west side of Mason County, where the hills roll into mesquite flats and the air carries the dry smell of sun-baked earth most of the year. My folks taught me to work with my hands, to stretch every penny, and to measure a person by the steadiness of their word. We kept Sundays for church, and the rest of the week was for mending fences, tending stock, and minding the land that had kept us alive through lean times. I married Tom when I was 23, and together we worked his family's ranch, turning hard soil and long days into a life we thought would last. The ranch wasn't rich land, but it was ours. We ran cattle lean in the dry seasons and pushed hard when the grass came in, selling just enough to keep the bank satisfied. Neighbors helped one another, passing along a spare calf or extra seed when a storm hit. But all that goodwill couldn't match the pull of money flooding in from the railroads and speculators. Folks with deeper pockets started buying up pastures, pushing smaller outfits into tighter corners, and men who'd once tipped their hats at us now came with papers and prices that felt more like threats. 3 months back, Tom took a bad fall while helping a neighbor move a restless string of cattle. We thought he'd walk it off, but complications set in. And before the leaves turned, I was standing alone at his graveside, with nothing but the mortgage notice in my pocket and a child on the way. Since then, every day had been a fight to keep the place from slipping away. One fence post, one overdue bill, one restless night at a time. The bank didn't care that I was alone or carrying. They only cared about the numbers on their ledger. That afternoon, with sweat stinging my eyes and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, I knew I was working on more than a cattle pen. I was building the last barrier between our home and the world that wanted to take it. But as the wind carried the creak of that stranger's boots on gravel, I had the sense that something was about to shift. I straightened, tightened my grip on the hammer, and waited for him to speak. Jake stepped forward, the brim of his hat lifting just enough for me to see the set of his jaw and the dust clinging to his cheeks. He asked if I could use a hand. His voice was even, the kind you hear from a man used to speaking to skittish horses or wary folks. I told him I had it under control and went back to the fence post, setting it straight in the hole. My hands were shaking from more than the weight of the work, but I wasn't about to show it. He didn't leave. Instead, he looked over the half-built pen and asked about the cattle in the pasture. I kept my eyes on the hammer, but answered. Told him a buyer was coming tomorrow, and I needed the pen finished so I could make the sale. I left out how much depended on that check. He didn't press, only nodded, as if weighing the work against the daylight left. I asked his name, and he said Jake Morrison, before mentioning he'd grown up not far from here and had some time to put in honest work. There was no swagger to it, no pity either, and that made me pause. I told him I could pay minimum wage for the day and not a cent more. He agreed, and we shook on it. His hand was calloused, like a man who worked for his keep, though his boots told another story. We worked side by side as the sun pushed lower. He handled the post hole digger like it was an extension of himself, the earth giving way smooth under his rhythm. I kept to my side, holding wire and checking posts, measuring each span by eye. From time to time, I caught him glancing my way, not like a man looking to rescue someone, but like he was taking stock of the ground between us. The air cooled as shadows stretched long across the pasture. I was holding a stretch of wire while he looped it tight around a corner post when a sharp pain lit up my back. It made my knees soften, and the wire slipped from my fingers into the dirt. Jake straightened fast, his eyes scanning my face. I told him I was fine, just needed a moment. But when I bent to pick the wire up, another pain hit stronger than the first. He set the pliers down and offered his arm. We walked slow to the house, my hand gripping his forearm tighter than I meant. Inside, I settled into the armchair by the front window. The place was neat, every surface in order, though there wasn't much to fill the space. Jake went to fetch water, and when he came back, I saw his eyes flick toward the table. Bills lay in neat stacks, most with red stamps across the top. I told him what they were without being asked. Explained about Tom's fall and the weeks in the doctor's care, how the bills had eaten through what we had, and the mortgage still wanted paying. His eyes stayed on me, listening without interruption. I spoke of the ranch, how it had been in Tom's family 3 generations, and of the cattle out in the pasture. Selling them wasn't just about money. It was about holding on to what we'd built for me and for the child on the way. When I finished, the room was quiet, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Jake set the glass down and said nothing more about it. He stayed a bit longer, then rose and said he'd be back early to help finish the pen before the buyer arrived. The next morning broke clear and warm. By mid-morning, the pen stood ready. I'd brushed the cattle and put on my cleanest dress, hoping to make a good impression. At 10 sharp, Jim Crawford's truck rolled up in a cloud of dust. He was a broad man with sun-creased eyes, the kind that had looked over 1,000 head before breakfast. Clipboard in hand, he walked the pen slow, making notes. I could read the signs before he opened his mouth, the slight shake of his head, the way he pressed his lips together. When he did speak, it was to offer a price so far below what I needed, it left me lightheaded. I tried to counter, explaining the quality of the cattle, the cost of feed, and my situation, but he only shrugged. "Market's tight," he said. "Business is business." Jake had been out of sight when Crawford arrived, but now he stepped out from behind the barn, his hand extended in greeting. The 2 men shook hands, and there was a flicker of recognition in Crawford's face. They spoke low words too quiet to carry, and after a few minutes, Jake pulled a small notebook from his pocket and walked a short distance away, speaking into it like he was dictating a message. When he came back, Crawford's manner had shifted. He spoke of other buyers he could reach, of premiums for certain herds, of long-term arrangements. Then, almost as an afterthought, he wrote out a check for nearly twice what he'd first offered. He said an associate had vouched for my stock and that he was willing to pay more than market to secure it. Crawford tipped his hat and left in a swirl of dust. I turned to Jake, questions on the edge of my tongue. He only said Crawford must have reconsidered. But I'd seen how the buyer looked at him, and I knew better. Jake gathered his tools without offering more. I watched him go, the check heavy in my hand, and the sound of his boots on the gravel fading toward the road. Something had shifted again, and I had the feeling I'd see him before long, with answers he wasn't ready to give. I sat at the kitchen table long after Crawford's truck had disappeared down the road, the check resting where I'd set it. Outside, the wind had quieted, the only sound the faint rattle of the corral gate in its latch. The number written there would keep the bank from breathing down my neck for a time. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way Crawford had looked at Jake and the way Jake had carried himself when they spoke. That wasn't the manner of a man living from one day's work to the next. The next morning, Jake came back to collect a few tools he'd left by the barn. I was already on the porch, waiting with coffee in hand. He thanked me for it, and was halfway down the steps when I told him plain that something wasn't adding up. His boots stilled on the gravel, and after a moment he came back up, removed his hat, and took a seat on the edge of the porch. He looked out toward the pasture before speaking. Jake said his full name, Jake Morrison, and told me he owned Morrison Ranch Holdings, a cattle operation spread across 3 counties. He'd started with a small herd on borrowed land, worked it himself, and built it into something that could keep dozens of families employed. He didn't say it to boast. The words came slow, like each one had weight. He said he'd been checking on property not far from here when he saw me working the fence alone. Watching me had stirred an old memory of his mother, widowed young, trying to keep her own ranch alive with no help and no one to give her a fair chance. He explained that Crawford bought stock for his operations and that one call from him was enough to change an offer. That was what had happened yesterday. Then he reached into his satchel and took out a packet of papers, laying them on the porch rail between us. It was a proposal for a partnership. He'd supply breeding stock, cover operating expenses, and split the profits 60% in my favor. The land would stay mine. The work and decisions would stay mine. But I'd have the backing to grow, instead of scraping by season to season. I read over the pages, my finger tracing the lines, though I already understood what they meant. It was no gift and no charity. It was a business deal, one that could secure the ranch for my child's future. Jake didn't press me for an answer, only said he'd be in town for a few days, and I could send word through the telegraph office if I decided to move forward. Then he stood, settled his hat, and walked back toward the road, leaving the papers where they lay. That night, I kept a lamp burning while I went over the figures. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint groan of the wind at the shutters. I thought of the months since Tom's death, the worry that had sat like a stone in my chest, the way the land had seemed to grow heavier under my care. This offer was a way to lift some of that weight without giving up the home we'd built. By the time the lamp burned low, I knew my answer. At first light, I saddled my mare and rode into town. The air was cool and the ground still held the pale blue shadows of dawn. At the telegraph office, I wrote my reply in a careful hand, authorizing the partnership as written. The clerk tapped it out while I waited, the clicks quick and sharp in the quiet room. When I stepped back outside, the street was waking, a delivery wagon rattling past a storekeeper, sweeping his front step, the smell of bread from the bakery. 2 days later, Jake rode in with a small crew, driving a dozen fine-blooded cattle and 2 sturdy breeding bulls. They unloaded them into the pasture, the animals stepping out with the easy confidence of stock that had been well cared for. Over the next week, they repaired a section of fence along the north line, built a new chute by the barn, and stacked fresh hay in the loft. Jake oversaw the work, but left the decisions to me, as he'd promised. By the end of that week, the ranch looked different, not just mended, but prepared. The corral held the new stock alongside my own, the fields were clear of debris, and the barn smelled of fresh-cut hay. The air around the place seemed lighter. Jake took his leave, then saying he'd be back before long to check on the breeding program and discuss the next steps. That evening, I walked the fence line alone. The sound of cattle shifting in the pasture and the first calls of nightbirds in the mesquite. The house windows glowed warm behind me, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the same edge of fear when I looked toward the dark horizon. Still, I knew the West had a way of testing even the best-laid plans. The thought had barely settled when I spotted a rider in the distance, silhouetted against the last light of day, heading toward the ranch at a steady pace. The rider drew closer, his figure taking shape against the last streaks of daylight. By the time he reached the gate, I recognized him as Samuel Reed, the post rider who brought mail to the outlying ranches. He dismounted with the ease of a man who'd been in the saddle most of his life, dusting his hat brim before climbing the porch steps. Without a word, he reached into his satchel and handed me an envelope bearing the seal of the county recorder's office. He tipped his hat, said he had 2 more stops before nightfall, and rode off into the darkening road. Inside, I broke the seal with the edge of my thumb. The letter inside was short, the kind that didn't waste ink. It confirmed receipt of a filing, a legal amendment, adding Morrison Ranch Holdings as a business partner to the Callaway spread, effective immediately. There was nothing in it I didn't already know yet. Seeing it on official paper gave the arrangement a weight that settled deep in my chest. I set it aside and stirred the coals in the stove, the room filling with the faint scent of burning oak. The days that followed moved with the steady rhythm of spring work. Calves were born on the north pasture, the older cattle shifted to fresh grass. Jake returned one afternoon with supplies and a few hands to help repair the windmill pump that had been failing since winter. The men worked under his direction, hauling up the pipe, cleaning the grit from the cylinder, and fitting new seals. By sundown, the pump was lifting water smooth and steady, the tank filling against a backdrop of swallows darting over the field. Each evening, I went over the ledger at the kitchen table, recording the day's work and counting costs against the next season's gains. The numbers told me what I already felt: the ranch was stronger than it had been in a long time. The barns were stocked, the fences mended, and the herd's condition was drawing notice. 2 neighbors rode over in the same week, both asking after the breeding bulls Jake had brought. I told them we'd see come summer, though the interest was a sign we were on the right trail. Still, the quiet didn't sit without edges. One afternoon, while I was checking the south fence, a stranger paused on the road, watching the pasture with his reins slack in his hands. He didn't call out or tip his hat, just studied the land before riding on. I mentioned it to Jake later, and he listened without comment, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, as if measuring something I couldn't see. By the second week of April, we had the branding fire going. The smoke rose in a thin column into a sky as clear as polished glass. The cattle moved through the chute one by one, the hiss of the iron followed by the low bawl of a calf released to its mother. Jake worked the head gate while I kept the fire fed and the tools ready. When it was done, the herd moved back to pasture, their fresh brands dark against new hair. That evening, Jake lingered by the hitch rail as the light faded. He said there were buyers in San Angelo looking for quality yearlings, and that we should be ready to move a portion of the herd when the time came. I told him I trusted his judgment on the matter, though I kept my own counsel about the pace at which things were changing. The next morning, I found another envelope on the porch, this one without a seal, the paper folded over twice and tied with string. Inside was a single sheet in Crawford's hand stating he'd be returning sooner than planned with an associate who wanted to see the stock for himself. No date was given, only the note that he'd send word ahead. I read it twice before tucking it into the ledger. The ranch work went on, but I kept an ear tuned for the sound of an approaching rider. Late one afternoon, with the sun leaning low, I heard it hoofbeats coming steady up the lane. I stepped onto the porch, shading my eyes, and saw 2 figures this time. One was Crawford, his bulk unmistakable in the saddle. The other I didn't know, but his coat was finer than most men wore for travel, and he sat his horse with the easy posture of someone accustomed to being listened to. They rode through the gate without breaking stride, the dust curling in their wake. Crawford swung down from his saddle first, tying his reins to the rail with a practiced knot. The other man followed slower, brushing trail dust from his coat before removing his gloves. Crawford introduced him as Matthew Kane, 42, an investor out of Fort Worth with a hand in several cattle ventures. Kane's handshake was firm, his eyes scanning the yard, the barns, and finally the pastures beyond without wasting a motion. Jake appeared from around the side of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. There was a brief exchange between the 3 men, low-voiced, but easy enough in tone. Then Jake gestured toward the pasture, and we all walked to the corral, where the new breeding stock grazed alongside my herd. Kane leaned against the top rail, studying the animals one by one, occasionally asking Jake about lineage, grazing conditions, and market weight. His questions were pointed but not unkind, the sort of talk that stayed close to the business at hand. After a time, we moved toward the barn. Inside, the scent of fresh hay and oiled tack hung in the air. Jake pulled open the ledger, where we'd kept breeding records since the partnership began, sliding it across to Kane without comment. Kane paged through, slowly tapping one entry with a gloved finger to ask about calf survival rates during the last cold snap. I answered him, directly explaining the measures taken and the results. He nodded once and closed the book. Outside, Crawford checked his watch against the sun and suggested they head back to town before losing the light. Before mounting up, Kane turned to me and said, He'd be in touch through Jake regarding a possible purchase later in the season. There was no promise in his voice, only the quiet assurance of a man who made decisions on his own timetable. They rode out, leaving the yard empty but for the settling dust. That evening, I found Jake at the workbench in the shed, repairing a hinge from one of the gate latches. I asked straight out what Kane's interest meant for the ranch. Jake set the hinge aside and said Kane had the means to place our yearlings in a premium market if he chose, but that nothing was certain until he made the offer. He spoke as though it was just another turn in the road, but I noticed he didn't meet my eye when he said it. Over the next week, the work carried on. We mended the far fence where spring rains had washed out the post line, moved the cattle to higher pasture, and prepared the north field for planting. The days warmed the air, carrying the smell of mesquite blossoms, and the herd settled into the new grazing rotation without trouble. Now and then, I'd see Jake studying the horizon, as if expecting a rider, though he never said so. One afternoon, while I was checking the barn loft, I found an envelope tucked between two feed sacks. My name was written on the front in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a note from Kane, brief and direct, stating he would return in 3 weeks with an offer for a portion of the herd. There were no terms, no figures, only his signature beneath the date. I folded it back into the envelope and slipped it into the ledger. The following days passed in a quiet that felt heavier than before. Jake kept to his work, but there was a stillness in his manner, as though both of us were holding our breath for what might come next. On the morning of the third Sunday, I stood at the porch rail after church, watching a dust cloud build far down the road. It moved steady, not like a stage or freight wagon, but like a single rider closing the distance. The rider came into view, slowing as he neared the gate. It wasn't Kane this time, nor Crawford, but a young man I didn't know. He was tidy in appearance, his coat brushed free of trail dust, and carried a leather satchel tied behind the saddle. He swung down, introduced himself as Daniel Price, a clerk out of the Fort Worth stockyards, and said he had been sent ahead with papers for my review before Kane's return. We sat at the porch table while he untied the satchel and laid out a packet of documents. The top page was an agreement Kane's offer for 20 head all yearlings from the new breeding stock at a price higher than I dared expect. The figures were neat, the language clear, but the delivery came with a condition: Kane wanted exclusive rights to purchase from our herd for the next 2 seasons. I read the clause, twice the weight of it settling like a stone. Jake arrived from the barn while I was still looking over the terms. Price stood to greet him, passing along Kane's regards. Jake's eyes scanned the papers quickly before he asked Price how long he'd be in the area. The young man said he'd be staying in town at the boarding house for 3 nights, should we have a reply by then. With that, he gathered his gloves and tipped his hat before riding back toward the main road. Inside, Jake and I went through the agreement line by line. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was measuring the risk in his head. The price was strong, the market connections valuable, but the exclusivity would tie us to Kane's operation in a way that might limit the ranch's independence. We discussed it late into the evening, the lamplight throwing long shadows across the table, each of us weighing the balance between immediate gain and long-term control. The next morning, I saddled my mare and rode the north pasture alone. The herd moved slowly through the grass, heads down, tails flicking in the warm breeze. The sight of them, healthy and sure-footed, sharpened my sense of what was at stake. This land and these animals weren't just a means to pay debts, they were the last piece of what Tom and I had built together. I turned back toward the house, with my decision forming clear in my mind. Jake was waiting in the yard when I returned. I told him I wanted to meet Kane face to face before agreeing to any clause that bound us for years. He agreed and said he would send word through Crawford that we'd expect Kane here when the deal was finalized. That evening, he rode into town to find Price and relay the message. 2 days later, Price returned with a simple note from Kane he'd be at the ranch by the end of the week, ready to discuss terms. There was no hint of his position, no sign of whether he'd bend on the exclusivity. The waiting began to stretch each day, thick with unspoken questions. I kept to the work, mending tack, checking the south fence, seeing to the calves. But the thought of that meeting sat in the back of my mind. On the 5th morning, with the air heavy and still before a storm, I heard the faint sound of hoofbeats far down the lane. By the time I stepped onto the porch, 2 riders were approaching Kane in front, Crawford a length behind. Both dismounted without hurry, their horses stamping at the heat. Kane removed his hat, offered a polite greeting, and said we should talk inside. Kane stepped inside first, his boots sounding solid against the pine floor. Crawford closed the door behind us, the air inside holding the faint scent of coffee and wood smoke. Kane set his hat on the table and drew out the papers he'd carried, placing them in the space between us. He spoke plainly the price he'd offered before still stood, but so did the exclusivity clause. He said it gave him assurance in the markets he served, where reliability meant as much as quality. I kept my hands folded in my lap while he talked, letting the words settle. Jake leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, listening without interruption. When Kane finished, I asked what would happen if market prices rose beyond his offer. His reply was immediate. Our agreement would hold for the term, but he'd aim to match market highs when possible. There was no boast in it, just business. The conversation shifted to the herd. Jake opened the ledger, pointing out growth in weight since Kane's last visit, the healthy calves already weaned, and the grazing plan that kept the pastures from thinning. Kane listened, nodding at intervals, his fingers tapping once against the tabletop when the numbers matched his liking. Crawford said little, though his eyes moved from me to Jake more than once, as if measuring the space between our positions. We paused when the clock in the corner struck the hour. Kane asked to see the herd before we spoke further. We walked out to the corral where the cattle stood quiet in the shade. He moved along the rail, his gaze settling on each animal, noting brands, checking lines, and occasionally asking about parentage. I answered as best I could, aware of Jake's presence a few steps away. Back inside, Kane rested his hands on the back of the chair before taking his seat again. He said the offer was fair, and that the exclusivity would mean stability for both sides. I told him I'd give my answer by morning. Something in my tone made him study me a moment before he agreed. Crawford gathered the papers, and the 2 men made ready to ride back before dark. After they left, Jake stayed behind at the table. He asked if I wanted his counsel. I told him I did. He said Kane's markets were strong and the price would carry us through 2 solid seasons, but the clause would mean we couldn't take higher bids elsewhere, even if they came. We talked until the lamplight thinned, the wind pressing soft against the windows. By the time we rose from the table, I knew I'd have to balance more than figures to make the choice. The night passed quiet, but with a weight in it. Just after dawn, I stepped onto the porch and saw the land washed in the pale light of morning. Somewhere in that stillness, my decision took shape. I poured coffee, set the pot near the stove, and waited for the sound of hoofbeats carrying my answer to Kane. Kane came back just after midday, Crawford alongside him. They tied their horses at the rail, and I met them on the porch, with the coffee already brewed. We sat at the table where the papers still lay, the morning light falling across them in a narrow stripe. Kane waited for me to speak first. I told him I'd take his offer on the 20 head at the price named, but without the exclusivity clause. The ranch needed the freedom to sell where the market was best, even if that meant he lost first call some years. His eyes stayed steady on mine, and after a moment he nodded. He said he respected a partner who guarded their ground. Crawford drew up the revised agreement on the spot, his pen scratching across the paper while the clock ticked in the corner. By late afternoon, the deal was signed, and Kane shook my hand, as if sealing something more than a sale. They rode out toward the west, the dust from their horses drifting high and thin before settling over the road. Jake stood beside me at the rail, the sound of the windmill turning slow in the quiet. The weeks that followed brought steady work and no surprises. Cain's men came for the yearlings, their lead drover counting the cattle with a nod of satisfaction. The rest of the herd grazed easy in the pastures, the calves growing strong on spring grass. Each evening I walked the fence line, the smell of mesquite on the air, the light turning gold over the hills. Jake kept his word, letting the ranch stay in my hands while backing it with the strength of his operation. We talked less about markets and more about what was ahead, the next calving, the new pasture rotation repairs before summer storms. The partnership that had begun with a hammer slipping from my hand was now set firm in something built on respect. One evening, with the cattle bedded down and the sky deepening to indigo, I stood on the porch and thought of the road behind me. The debts paid, the land secure, the child I carried soon to be born into a home that would stand for her. Out here, justice hadn't come from courts or strangers, but from work done honest and alliances kept true. Life on the frontier teaches you that strength isn't always loud, and help worth having never comes with strings meant to bind. Sometimes it arrives quiet, wearing a plain coat and scuffed boots, ready to put in the day's work beside you. And when it does, you don't forget it. If you've ever seen a hard season turn because someone stood with you, I'd be glad to hear it. Share your story or pass this one along. There's always someone who needs the reminder that no one rides this trail alone.